This case has got a serious problem, a really dangerous one that could result in you getting electrocuted or your system being destroyed. And that might sound dramatic, but I want to show you what I mean and talk about why it's important to know before you buy. Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the Corsair 6500X, which as you can see is a stunning looking case once you've finished a build, and it is a very glorious case in a number of ways, but it does have an issue, and that issue isn't down to my awful cable management that you can see here, more on that in a little while, but instead comes about if using a behind the front motherboard, so a rear connect motherboard like this ASUS Tough motherboard, which has its connections all at the back. This is a really clean design and it fits perfectly in the 6500X, allowing you to create a really good looking PC build potentially, which I'll show you more clips of in a little while. And I'm going to do a separate detailed guide on how to recreate it if you want to do the same, so subscribe to see that. But when you've installed the motherboard, obviously the connections are at the rear, which includes the power cables, like the 24-pin power cable on the left, and two 8-pin CPU power cables that need to plug in at the top. In order to do that, you need to remove the hard disk drive cage, which you also have to remove the power supply unit for because it's hooked in at the bottom there, which is a really stupid design, but that's another point. And once you access this, you can see you can then get to the back of the motherboard. You'll notice the cage itself has holes in it, and that's so that the two 8-pin CPU power connectors have space to breathe. Now, I'm using the Corsair RM Shift power supply unit here, which fortunately has some thin cables that you can connect up and then manage a little bit at the top here. This then allows you to put the cage back in place and reinstall the power supply once you've done that, which is quite a faff. But as you can see, you can then see the two 8-pin CPU power connectors at the rear here. In theory, you can then slot your hard disk drive into that. However, doing so, I then discovered a bit of a problem. I couldn't get it back out. So I would highly recommend not doing this. Don't put the drive in here because you will find there is a significant issue. And I found this once I went about taking out the cage again, just so I could remove that hard disk drive from the system. Because then, when I did that, I then got a closer look. And as you'll see, I've shredded the cables. So the protective housing around these cables is now gone, and the cables themselves are exposed. From this angle, you can see what I'm talking about. You can see the cable, the way it pokes through the back of the case here. It pokes into the cage. They've obviously designed that to make it easier to get these cables in there without forcing the cage down on top of it. The downside to this is obviously, as I've shown, that if you try and put your cage in, it's going to rub against those cables. So, like putting an empty cage in there, for example, you can see just becomes a problem. So I actually managed to damage them a bit more there. Now, obviously, you could put the bay in either way. It wouldn't go in like that because you have to force it over the cables, and then it gets stuck immediately. And if you do it this way around, you're going to have the same issue. The drive simply won't go in there without rubbing against the cables. Now, there's no solution to that I can see, other than just abandoning that entirely and just using this one instead. And obviously leaving a gap there. Important point though. As you can see, this is quite a niche issue. If you're not even going to use hard disk drives or SSDs, you could abandon it. And as you can see, you can end up with a really nice looking system. This is with IQ Link. It's set up in here. The rear connect motherboard ends up looking particularly clean and quite nice. I'm going to do a full review later on where I do some thermal testing and some comparisons with a previous build that I did. But it is a very nice setup here, but I think that is one of the most shocking design features of this case, that you could potentially shred your power supply cables, then presenting a particular danger, all for the sake of a nice aesthetic. And it does limit your options. You do have options though. You can top mount a 360mm radiator, or you could side mount one here like I have with a push-pull setup with tubes at the bottom with Corsair's IQ Link H150i, and you end up with a really nice design with one caveat which I'll get to in a minute. But the back of the case is a bit of a nightmare. This is another design problem with the case, and I have tried to cable tidy, believe it or not. But I've also built in it twice and had similar issues. And it's worse with the BTF motherboard because although all the cables are hidden at the rear, it's very difficult to access them and to be able to plug them in a neat way and to run the cables and tidy them up so that they're particularly clean. With a bare naked shot of the case that you can see here, you'll see there's very little channeling in this case. There's none of the usual historic channeling that Corsair used to have on their cases. You have a few hoops that you can tie your cables to, but it's not great. An example of what I mean here with the cable management is this. So you can see I've cable tied a lot of the cables, and it's on the various loops down this area. But I'm now blocking the SATA ports at the bottom of the motherboard. You can just about access them still, but it's going to be tricky. The front panel connector is also close to these cables, and you can see there's also a lot of other cables that are in the way. Now, obviously you could potentially pull these up a bit, maybe get them out of the way, but if you look up, here, there isn't really much room. So even if you tied them over to the right, which there's less loops for, to be honest, you're still going to have to force them over this way quite a bit for them to get out of the way. And there's a number of power cable connectors here, which is fairly interesting for the behind the front connections. You actually have 3 8-pin power connectors for your graphics card, or one 12-volt high power connector. And then you've got USB-A, USB-C 24-pin. Now, the USB-A connector is interesting as well, because obviously we've got an additional one of those, because this case supports 4 USB-A front panels. But obviously, if you haven't got 2 of these ports on your motherboard, you're in trouble, and this motherboard doesn't have, so you can only use 2 of those connectors, which is another thing that's worth knowing about this case. There was something else that I want to point out here, which was a bit of a user error problem, but might be worth knowing if you're considering buying still and want to build in this in a similar way. So I'm mounting 3 120mm RX120 fans at the bottom of the case. While doing so, I discovered that it was really difficult to screw these in this format, and the reason for this is quite obvious once you know it, so it's worth knowing, but I just had a bit of a struggle trying to get these in because the tubes on the bottom of the radiator are pushing up against them. Now, Corsair recommends doing tubes down in this orientation if you look at their website, and the reason for this is you don't want air bubbles going into the pump, which is something that Gamers Nexus has covered plenty and loads of people are aware of already, but always tell you you're wrong when you're trying to install it. But anyway, I've got tubes at the bottom here. I'm trying to put those 3 fans in. I found they wouldn't fit. I thought I was going to end up having to just use 2 at the bottom here instead. So you might have the same issue, that perhaps those tubes are just not enabling you to install the fans in this way. So maybe you have to opt for 2 fans. But what I found actually is that was wrong. What I needed to do instead was to push the radiator up right to the top of the tray. Because if you don't do this, it could then push the radiator tray out of its little notches at the bottom of the case, and obviously it stops the fans from being installed. But if you jam it right to the top of that tray and install it that way, then it will work. Note that I've got a push-pull setup here with 2 different sorts of fans from Corsair's IQ Link system. I want to talk about how you can do that now, and how IQ Link has improved vastly recently, and it's worth having a look at as well. So subscribe if you haven't already to see that video. But you'll see once you've jammed that up there, you can then install the fans and maneuver them around at the bottom there. And it shouldn't be too much of an issue. The end result is a really nice looking case, with that obvious caveat of really just don't use the hard disk drive cage if you're installing a rear connect motherboard. Go for NVMe SSDs instead maybe in your system. This motherboard supports multiples, so that would be a good solution there. This might not even be an issue for you. Maybe you're not even thinking about using hard disk drives or standard SSDs. Anyway, I thought it was worth highlighting. And I like to do this sort of thing, go in as much depth as possible with cases and poke and prod around and see what problems I can cause. So subscribe and come back to see the full review, where I'll go into a lot more depth on this because I've built in it in 2 different ways now. I'm also going to use the upgrade parts, including a vertical GPU mount and the additional brackets and things that you can get for this case soon. So that should be interesting too. But I think it looks really nice by the end of it. One of the cleanest builds that I've done. There's only 1 cable on the front of the motherboard, which, let me know if you can see that. But here you can see it with NZXT single frame fans and a top mounted radiator. If you want to see a slightly different view and a different aesthetic, and I'll cover both of those in the review and talk about that in a bit more depth. Both look really nice, and it is definitely less of a problem if you're doing it this way around, because you can still use the hard disk drives because all the power connectors are on the standard motherboard at the front. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Thanks very much for watching. Appreciate you.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.